welcome to the Italian Cultural Institute. My name is Paulo Barreira, I'm the interim director here, and I'm very happy to see so many of you for this wonderful evening. As you might know, October is an important month for Italian culture. It is the Italian Heritage Month, first of all, and there's a very large number of initiatives and events going on in the city. And also, October has become traditionally the month where Italian cultural institutes and consulates and embassies around the world organize the International Week of the Italian language, la settimana della lingua italiana nel mondo. The week will be actually in 10 days, will be from the 21st to the 28th, but we think that this can be considered a very interesting prologue to the week. So I couldn't be happier to honor the month of Italian culture and the week of the Italian language with our very distinguished guest. And I'm very happy to welcome to the Institute Jhumpa Lahiri, who needs no introduction. And in conversation with her, a great friend of the Institute, the director of Casa Italiana, Zereli Marimo, Stefano Albertini. There will be maybe 30, 40 minutes conversation, and then we'll open to the public for Q&A. And there's only one question that is not allowed, which is, why didn't you include such and such in the anthology? And a reminder, as you saw, there are books for sales outside. There's only the English edition because they sold out the Italian one, but they will gladly accept back orders. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm leaving the floor to Jhumpa and Stefano. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you, Paolo. And just for full disclosure, Paulo Barreira arrived at Casa Italiana before I did, because he got a PhD from NYU in Italian literature. So there is a connection there. And aside from Jhumpa, we have the fortune of having in the audience two of the translators that participated in the making of this fabulous book, Anne Goldstein and Michael Moore. Be sure that we are going to pick on them as well. And since this is the week dedicated to Italian language, I would like just to say that Jhumpa Lahiri was an unexpected gift to Italian language, and that she alone probably served the purpose of the promotion of Italian language more than Casa Italiana, the Institute, and other dozens of institutions like that around the world. Very humbly, we recognize that the fact that she embraced the Italian language with such passion and determination, and not only to learn Italian, but she was very clear from the beginning that she wanted to become an Italian writer, with all that took in terms of becoming acquainted not only with the linguistic structures, but also with the literary translation. And in this book, I think we have the proof of her more than full immersion in the Italian literary tradition that she embraced and with which she enters in a constant dialogue. The book, it's a very ambitious work. You see how big it is. It took Jhumpa about 3 years to make, and it's something that sort of took her back and forth in her constant pilgrimage between Rome and New York and Princeton. And in her introduction, that is a fantastic piece to read. She mentions at least two antecedents to these collection of short stories. One by Enzo Siciliano, that it's actually two different parts. One is a 1 volume and one is 2 volumes for the Meridiani Mondadori. It's a collection of Italian short stories. And the other one is Vittorini, that did somehow the operation that is symmetrical to what Jhumpa did. Americana, translating into Italian the great American writers of the time. It's a book that had some misadventures with the fascist regime. It was censored before, then republished with an introduction of a critic that was seen well by the regime, and therefore it could be seen. And it really revolutionized Italian literature, not only because people had access to these writers, but because they could come in contact with a different writing style, completely different. So the first question for Jhumpa is that these two works that somehow inspired you, did they also intimidate you on some level? Or how did you think that your work would be different, and how these could be definitely a collection of stories? And the interesting thing is that there are the authors and the translators that are authors in their own right somehow. And some of the stories have been translated for the first time for this book. And some of them, the translation has been redone. And for some, you use the translations that were already available. And we'll talk about that. So how this is Jhumpa's book? Because it is. And it's like you use many pieces of a puzzle, you put them together, you decide an order that you wanted to give. Of course, you had the luxury of deciding who would make it and who would not make it. The criteria, general criterion, was it had to be writers of the 20th century, roughly, and not alive. But what makes it Jhumpa compared to these two sort of lighthouses that you mentioned in your introduction, Siciliano for the Italian and Vittorini for the Americans?
Certainly. First of all, buonasera a tutti. I want to thank everyone at the Institute, and especially Giorgio van Straten, who is not here, but who initially extended this invitation. And we miss him tonight. But I wanted to mention him. He is also part of this book. He is the reason Bilenki is part of this collection. Thank you to you, Stefano. Thank you to all my friends, to Michael, to Anne, for being here. Yeah, I mean, there were actually 3 books in the end, other books that were guiding me, right? Vittorini, absolutely, and I was conceiving. I conceived this book as a response, as a mirror to his book. The opposite, right? Going in the opposite direction. And I personally feel revolutionized by the discovery of these authors. I hope that other English language readers and writers will feel similarly excited, just as readers and writers in Italy in the 20th century, when Americana came out, were deeply influenced and inspired, and it was the source of a sort of revolution in terms of how what writing even was or could be. Really marked a generation and then left a lasting mark that continues today, I would say, continues today. We see the signs of Vittorini's work and that anthology. And then there was Siciliano's project, big project, which was also very much his project. I mean, he was very generous. He put in so many names. There were many of his friends and many living authors, right? So that's very different from this book, from the Penguin anthology. He himself was in the anthology, so it was a different kind of vision that he had. It was very important to me because I thought, first of all, I looked at the table of contents simply to get an idea of who might be part of my book, because there are many more names in his anthology than are in this book. There are only 40 authors. Or there are 40 authors in this book. And it's really interesting because people keep asking, well, why did you pick 40 and why wasn't it? And really, there are some things that are not negotiable, and this was not negotiable when I spoke with my editor at Penguin. She said, pick 40 authors. That's the number you need to pick. So there really wasn't a big conversation to have there. And I even suggested, what about 50? What about 45? And there was this back and forth, like at Porta Portese, and then they said, no, 40 authors. She said 40 authors. And so that's why there are 40 authors.
And by the way, that alone is a fundamental work, because nobody else would have succeeded in convincing an American publisher to publish 40 short stories of mostly unknown Italian authors. My translator friends here know how difficult it is even to propose a well-known, established, recognized in Europe writer. So this alone is a enormous effort that you underwent, and you were able to sell it and to have them produce the anthologies. 40 is fine. It's good. It's a good number.
I think it's a good number. It's arbitrary in the end, but it's a good number, and I worked with that. I worked with that limitation in mind, and it was important to me to then have the freedom to choose the 40 authors that made the most sense to me in this moment. And in that sense, it is very much my anthology. I think every anthology bears the imprint of its editor. I was thinking curatore, of the editor. And but the other book eventually that also forms a part of the conversation with the other anthologies is Primo Levi's anthology, which is extremely personal, La ricerca delle radici, and there we really have sort of the texts that are most important and meaningful to him in his life for his own development. And they're not entirely all in Italian. I mean, so that book is interesting because there's translation,
yes.
Right? It's multilingual. And I actually didn't even know about the book until a year ago. I was ignorant of the book, or if I knew about it, I just had it in sort of far reaches of my mind, but I wasn't thinking about it as in dialogue with this book. And so then, as the book was coming to a finish, I thought, oh yes, then there's that other book. There's Levi's project, and so I sort of made space, and so my book, I think this anthology is a bit in the middle, in that it's not as extremely personal as Levi's anthology, which is essentially a collection of his these readings, these books that he kept together on a shelf, that he consulted, that he felt so deeply connected to, nor is it sort of trying to answer to anybody's expectation other than my own. And the expectation was simply that it be a fresh and surprising anthology. This was the purpose for me. And as I've said before, I mean, it really does grow out of my life, one of my new lives as a professor at Princeton, as a professor of writing and translation, working with students and having a mission there in the classroom to the desire to share my new love for Italian writing alongside other authors and traditions that I have come to love and respect and learn from over the years. So the book really grows out of the desire to have a sort of personal textbook to share. So I was also thinking of that. I was also thinking of the students. I was thinking of how my students had already reacted to certain authors, what excited them, what questions we raised, what questions they raised. So that was also a factor for me.
And the fact is also that as much as you are an Italian writer, you remain also an American writer, to assure your readers in the US that seem very worried about these escapades.
They're very worried.
You see, they're so worried that they're doing something to the lights. But your look, your gaze on Italian literature is deeply from the inside, because you're extremely connected with contemporary writers. It's the fact that you became a writer in Italy also by hanging out with writers, by becoming friends with them, by sharing ideas. And I love that communal dimension that you bring into your understanding of Italian literature, and understand that your choices were definitely based on your taste, on your preferences, but they were also the result of an ongoing dialogue with the present literary community, with the people who are writing now, with your colleagues in Italy.
Absolutely. And so many of the writers I felt already inspired to put into the anthology were writers I discovered through my friendships with other writers. So, from Giorgio, appunto. So he's a writer friend who said, "Have you read Romano Bilenchi? You should." So I read him. Francesca Marciano, who said, Anna Maria Ortese is a writer you need to know. And these were writers I was ignorant of before I moved to Rome. I hadn't heard of them. I was in another dimension, and I was thinking about other things, and I was reading other writers. So everything really intensified once I got to Rome, and once I was reading only in Italian, and because when I got to Rome, I was able to make friendships in Italian, and so that really, enabled me to have these sort of long, thoughtful conversations, and to meet other writers, and to feel, to have, because that's the best thing about being a writer, really, is that you can find out what everybody else is reading, and go home feeling so excited to get up the next day and to go to the bookstore,
And Jhumpa, you mentioned Ortese, and I believe there are 13 short stories by women. Is that correct?
I think it's 11.
11?
Yeah.
11. This is a recurrent theme, much more in the United States than in Italy. But there is a problem also in Italy of the way in which women writers are represented, especially from the past. Now, situation has changed now, partly. What about these women writers? Did you feel a special connection with them? Ortese was suggested by a friend. Were there others that you knew already? And which were the eye-openers in the women writers? Then we'll talk about everybody else.
I think each of them opened my eyes. I mean, I knew before I started the project, before I even, moved to Italy, I knew I had read Morante, I had read Natalia Ginsburg, I'd read Grazia Deledda. So I knew three. And then I read Ortese, and then I read, a friend of mine gave me Cristina Campo, writer friend. These are all writers, and I list them all in the back of the book, because almost nearly, as I say in the acknowledgements, almost each story really comes to me from another writer, and I know in the beginning when I was writing my introductions, I wanted to actually thank each person, but I wasn't. Anyway, that didn't emerge in the final version, but I know that information. I know that, I equate in my mind Cristina Campo with Chiara Mezzalama and so on and so forth. So, because literally that's how they came to me, across my radar. Lalla Romano, I discovered reading a newspaper article. I was reading La Stampa, and there was a review of one of her books, and I read it, and I thought, she seems really interesting, and I went to the bookstore. I said, I want some books by Lalla Romano. There weren't any. I had to pre-order them. They were hard to find, and then I had to find, my way to her books. And so she was a project. She was also one of the authors I chose to translate, because when I read her, I felt that urge to translate her. Fabrizia Ramondino, I know because of Tiziana Rinaldi Castro. She said, do you know Fabrizia? Do you know Fabrizia's work? No. You have to read her. So, and I remember she told me that in my house in Brooklyn, and I made a note, and then the next time I was near Feltrinelli, I went and I bought Altenopis, and I read it, and I thought, oh my God. And so I was so happy to know that she also was a short story writer, and I translated her story as well. And then there's Alba de Céspedes, translated by by Michael Moore, a discovery, a total discovery. Actually, I knew about her only because one of my colleagues at Princeton, Pietro Frassica, very kindly gave me a sort of starter list when I told him about the project, and it was a starter list of, I don't know, 85 authors, but she was on it. And really what I did in that first year was I had all of these names and lists and my own lists and lists from going to dinner parties in Rome and just asking people, who are short story writers you like, and going to libraries and going to bookstores and going to Porta Portese and finding things and asking people, and then asking people here and just asking, just doing a kind of sondaggio, like who do you think is... And then I spent a year or more just going to the library in Princeton and looking at and finding the books and reading Alba de Céspedes and reading Fausta Cialente and reading, Luce d'Eramo. These are some of the other women in the anthology who were discoverers, who were later discoveries. I didn't know about them before. So it's the book represents sort of phases of of this journey into Italian literature.
And this process that I find very interesting, that is a process that involves an intellectual community, the community of the writers that are your friends with whom you have this dialogue, and then actually a treasure hunt, like footwork, and going to the bookstores and finding and coming back and ordering and so on, says something about how some of these authors are almost forgotten in Italy as well, or very hard to find in recent editions. And something that you notice in your introduction is also the fact of how, on the other hand, English language authors, and in particular American authors, are immediately available in Italy, and not necessarily the great authors. You find really any American author. And as an American writer, you find a discrepancy. And in this, somehow, you don't use the term, I'll use it, imperial language that seems to dominate, and especially in the English-speaking world, is perceived as the only literary language. So when I've been thinking a lot, because I know that every time you appear in public, there is somebody who asks you, why did you go to Italy? Why did you start studying Italian? Why did you want to? And I think in that awareness of the fact that there are languages outside of English as the dominant language, there is a lot to learn also from a writer. Of these authors, which one would you say in Italy now is the most forgotten, is the one that you found more surprised when you mentioned that you would include him or her in your anthology?
In the anthology?
Yeah.
A few. I would mention Delfini. I would mention Carlo Cassola. I would mention Fausta Cialente. I would mention Luce d'Eramo, Alba de Céspedes, very hard to track down at this point. Lalla Romano has had a sort of reflowering. In recent years, Einaudi has republished a number of her works, and so they aren't all absent from the bookstore. But it depends, because it's all about backlists. It's all about what the editors are willing to keep in publication and get onto the shelves. And it's all an ecosystem of how the writers either end up in a Porta Portese pile on a Sunday.
Porta Portese.
It's a big Sunday flea market in Trastevere, where I live in Rome, and many vendors, many very high quality book vendors, and then some sort of mediocre vendors. But it's a great place to go and find book titles, by, and then you get also often the sort of original editions of like De Céspedes, or you see the covers of Savigno's novels or collections of stories. So you really have a very more immediate sense of what the impact of that writer was, or that title was, in the time that it actually was produced, which is exciting. So I try to go every week, and I always find treasures. But those are a few that certainly I felt, But the other thing is, it really all depends so much on perspective, because, for example, one of the people who really helped me put this anthology together, was giving me a lot of, following me, was a friend, former colleague, named Alessandro Giammei, who now teaches Italian in our friend. He teaches now at Bryn Mawr. And he was at Princeton when I was working on this. He had a postdoc at Princeton for the exact same 3 years, my first 3 years. And he would say, he's 32 or something. Yeah. So he would say things like, "Ma no, Moravia, no, ma che noia." So he would say like these authors, no, they're like old. They're like, oh, my dad's generation, or even worse, my Pavese, no. And I would say,
I can totally picture him.
And and I would say, Alessandro, but they are speaking to me. Carlo Casola is speaking to me. Maybe he's not speaking to you. Maybe he represents something for you, but I'm coming from the outside. And so in a way, to go back to your first question, what makes this different? Well, what makes this different is obviously that I'm not Italian. So really, just that is like a basic fact of my point of view and my point of entry into all of this. So that also I thought was important, to repropose certain authors. And so, for example, with Moravia, whom everybody, I hope, is familiar with the works of Alberto Moravia and his just the enormous place he holds in terms of, especially in the short story form in Italy. But sorry. But I tried to, so with him, also with Elsa Morante, who is one of these big, towering figures, I tried to find lesser known work or sort of an aspect of these authors that wasn't, oh yeah, the Roman stories, or oh yeah. So that was also fun for me. It was fun for me to find a volume of Morante's earlier stories, just to see, okay, let's put in a story of sort of this writer in her very beginnings, and mix it up with stories, incredibly mature stories by people like Sciascia or Pavese or whomever. So sort of to show a range, because I think the problem with a lot of anthologies is that maybe the editors feel a sense of, oh, I have to find the best one. I have to find the most representative one. I have to find the one that really is. And I just, as a writer, I feel like that's such an odd way of going about it. I'm interested in the peaks and the valleys of artists' lives, and I think everything in some sense is interesting and illuminating. And I think if you already know and appreciate the work of someone like Moravia or Morante, it's more interesting to see, and the point of this book is really just it's like an appetizer. It's saying, here's a taste, now go and read more and explore and go deep. And if you like, if you liked the story by Alvaro, well, you can spend the next 3 years reading Alvaro, okay? So this is not the end point. This is just the trampoline. It's a jumping off point.
And that's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading it, that there are going to be many surprises also for the Italians, and there are going to be discoveries, because people even that are familiar with some of the names or all of the names will find things that they don't know. No,
this is absolutely true, because what I realized as my list was getting more concrete, and then I would sort of test it. I would test drive it at dinner parties and things like that. And I have yet to meet anybody, even an Italian reader, who says, maybe with the exception of Domenico Starnone, with whom I actually arrived at the final list, and he was at my side, sort of helping when I was saying, what do I do? What do I do with, I don't know. There were obviously people who aren't there, right? And he helped me to sort of live with what it would feel like to not have, X very important writer in the anthology, since we're not going to talk about that aspect of the project. But really very, very few people have said, they look at the back and they say, oh yeah. Oh, I don't know that. Oh, I don't know that one. You know, or I've never read anything. Did she really write short stories? So there's always some element of surprise.
Absolutely.
Even for the Italian, and I think the reader, the reader familiar with this period and these the world of these authors, right? So there are always people who fall to the side. And so these projects are important because they're a way to then cast light and take your flashlight and not just look at the central work over the mantle, but also look kind of behind the curtains and say, who's hiding behind there, you know?
Yesterday I saw Jhumpa briefly, and I asked her a favor, if she could prepare a passage in English of one of the short stories from the book, and then a passage in Italian, one original novel. Did you do your homework?
But I did, but I don't have, now if we don't have the book in Italian, we have a little problem. Okay. Okay, that's good.
And while you look for them, should I ask a couple of questions to Michael and Anne?
Sure.
Yeah.
Why don't I look at this and, okay.
So Anne Goldstein and Michael Moore, as you know, they're two very, very accomplished literary translators from Italian into English. They have together worked on the complete works of Primo Levi, and they've translated Baricco, Calabresi, Henri De Luca, and help me out, Manzoni and Ferrante. How could I forget Ferrante? I mentioned the complete works of Primo Levi. So it's a question about translating short stories, first of all. How is it different to translate a short story, let's say, from translating the small book you're working on right now, Michael, those 650 pages of The Betrothed? But really, how is the dynamic different in translating the short story? And if there is anything in particular that you discovered thanks to the choice that Jhumpa made in these.
After the Manzoni, I only want to do short stories.
Also because everything seems short.
Well, because the end is in sight, you know, as soon as you sit down. But I mean, I enjoy short stories. I like the idea of a true short story, you know, that is sort of written on a single breath almost, but contains an entire world within it. So, you know, I like that I can have that single focus on something. And, you know, and I am going to revise it to death like I revise everything else. But, you know, I think I like that. I like being able to sort of sit in one place and see it in one sitting and translating in one sitting if possible. So it feels very natural to me. I don't know how Anne feels about short stories.
Oh, I like doing short stories. I mean, it's like you get a taste of an author in a short space without having to read the whole novel. No, I mean, of course, novels are wonderful, but I like doing, like I guess I did two stories, and I like doing two different stories and seeing the differences and figuring out how to convey those differences as a translator. So I think it was really, I was very grateful to be able to work on this.
Yeah, that would be my next question. Since it's short and compact, is there a way for you to think more about stylistically how to render exactly that style? When you face a novel, probably the concerns are very different, and you are working on an extended number of pages for many days. And in that case, you perceive a style, a concept maybe in the language. So are you more inclined to try to find solutions or rhetorical devices that would reflect more the style of the author when you do a short story?
I mean, I think I do that anyway. So, I mean, really, especially on a longer novel, you have more of a chance actually to test different approaches. And then maybe by the time you're done, you realize that what you did at the beginning is all wrong. And so you go back 600 pages where, you know, in a short story, you go back 5 pages. But I also wanted to add it to sort of complement what you were saying about Jhumpa. For years, I was the director of the Penn Translation Fund, where we gave small grants to translators from many different languages into English. And throughout the world, the best literary prose tends to be the short story. And when we sort of think of the old scale of literary, the old ladder of what's best in literature, they always placed poetry at the top. And somehow today it's become the short story. And most of the best work that we would get were short stories, but we could not find publishers. And publishers would always say to us, unless your name is Jhumpa Lahiri, we're not going to publish short stories. So I think she's done something immense. And I am amazed, I have to say, because I think that this is the age of the short story. Maybe because I take the subway, maybe because we all have, shorter attention spans.
True.
But I'm sort of surprised at the appetite for big, fat novels that certainly American publishers have, the beauty of the short story is that there's like no fat. There's just, something that's very focused.
Absolutely. And do you want to add something?
No, I know, just that I agree that really in a novel as well, you're looking for solutions to every sentence.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you do have
And
more
what I didn't mention before is that in Jhumpa's introduction, of course, she also gives an historical account of the importance of the short story in the Italian literary tradition. And it's something that is overlooked. We think at the origin, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. So you have epic poetry, love poetry, and then, of course, finally, short stories. What is really more resistant, though, is definitely Boccaccio. Who is going to write a poem in the style of Dante today? Whereas the tradition of the short story can still be revitalized, and not to mention even a collection of stories before that predate the Decameron, and that you mentioned, Novellino, Cento Novelle, Conto delle Conte Neapolitan. It's a really Italian form of literature that even in Italy has been neglected. I mean, when we studied in the high school system, rarely, aside from Boccaccio, because you cannot avoid it, rarely we get into the other authors or the other short stories written by other authors, particularly in the 19th and 20th century. So it's not only important for what you did bringing it to the United States, but also to refocus the attention on a genre that is typically Italian and that has been somehow forgotten, and that now, for many reasons, is coming back.
Let's hope.
Speriamo.
Let's hope. Speriamo.
Allora,
So,
what are you going to read for us?
Well, I'm torn. I will work from the things that I translated in either language, just because I feel particularly close to them. Meglio? Okay.
Spegnilo.
So, prima in italiano o prima in inglese? Ok. So, this is... E quanto leggo? Un paragrafo? Così? O così? Lungo. Okay. So, this is the opening of Malinconia by Gofredo Parisi. He is an author I didn't know about until I moved to Rome. And then how did I discover him? If there are a few channels, they're all through my life in Trastevere, because I remember Francesca Marciano also telling me to read him. And then I met through Marco De Logu, I met Giusetta, his companion, an amazing artist, Giusetta Fioroni, who was at his parties. And so I would talk to her, and she was always very kind to me because she knew I was a writer, and she would anyway, so we would have very interesting conversations. So I chose a story of Parisi from an amazing work of sort of never just a sui generis kind of work called the Syllabari, which was originally 1 volume and then became 2 volumes, and that published at one point as 1 volume. There's a lot of complicated details in terms of how the stories are originally conceived and then published and then sort of packaged, if you will, by the authors themselves. So Parisi is an interesting case because he was writing these pieces for Corriere della Sera as a rubrica, as a column at a weekly, and they're all sort of basically states of mind or emotions following the alphabet, letters of the alphabet. So under M, there are a couple of entries, and this story is called Malinconia, melancholy, and it really, it just spoke to me, and the experience of translating it was also probably the most memorable because so most of the translation work I do when I'm in the United States, because it just seems like that's where it makes most sense for me to be translating.
Maybe, Jhumpa, we should inform our members of the audience that don't know that on top of becoming an Italian writer in the past few years, you also became a translator.
I also became a translator.
And a professor. So
yes,
a lot of
there
new
are
jobs.
Various, yes.
But translation in particular became a very important part of your profession. And from what I understand, the passion that you have when you talk about it, it gave a different perspective also to you as a writer.
It did, as it should, as it did for so many of the authors in this book, right? So because it's so...
But many are authors and translators.
So many, the majority.
And to me, all translators are authors. They end up writing their own book.
Yes, absolutely. And the vast majority are hybrid author-translators, which in the United States is still a kind of not a very prevalent category in the literary world. But in Italy, at least in this moment in Italian literary history and culture, it was the norm. It wasn't the exception to the norm. In any case, but this story by Parisi, it just because I was, on a deadline and I had to get the translations done. So I remember actually translating this story in Rome. And I think it's the only thing I translated in Rome. And I remember very vividly, it was the winter and my husband and the kids had gone back to Princeton because they had to go to school, and I was just staying on for a couple of weeks for the saldi, and important things in life. And one day I was just alone in the apartment, and I started translating this story, and it was really the only thing I've ever translated where I really did know exactly what was coming next without reading. Like I just had this complete sort of fusion with Parisi, and I knew I could intuit what the next sentence was going to be. It was a little bit like how, if you know certain sort of, sometimes with classical music, you can sort of anticipate what the next phrase is going to be because it's a sort of part of a system that you intuit, and it was like that with this story. So it was really very powerful. Is what I'm trying to say, and I just translated it in 2 sittings, just like that, and that's not normal. Or if it is, it's a kind of a very bad translation that one has to really wake up the next day and say, "Oh my God, what is that?" But this one emerged with a certain, I don't know, just with a different ease, if you will. So I'm particularly fond of it for that reason. So this is Malinconia, just the beginning in Italian. Ogni giorno di quella lontana e fresca estate, i bambini della colonia Bedin Alighieri, una colonia per poveri mandata avanti da suore altrettanto povere, le Dorotee, venivano fatti alzare di buon'ora e per poi uscire subito nei prati o nel boschetto di pini alla sommità della collina. Li sorvegliavano 2 suore giovani, vestite tutte di bianco per l'occasione estiva, anziché del saio nero e la cuffa nera infantili, anche loro e piccole quasi quanto i ragazzi. C'erano maschi e femmine, e tra le femmine un ospite di nome Silvia, chiamata ospite perché nipote di uno dei fondatori socialista, che povero non era. Ecco perché Silvia, a differenza di tutti gli altri, anziché indossare il grembiule e d'obbligo della colonia, di colore grigio senza colletto e di tela molto povera, poteva scegliere ogni giorno nel suo piccolo guardaroba i suoi soliti abiti, le sue scarpe di sempre e non sandali di gomma rossa che facevano parte dell'uniforme, e perfino bambole o giocattoli di sua proprietà che si era portati da casa. Dormiva però in camerone con tutte le bambine e per il resto della giornata di Silvia era uguale a quella degli altri. Stessa piccola colazione, stesso pranzo, stessa merenda al pomeriggio e stessa cena. Anche il lettino smaltato di bianco e le lenzuola ruvide con una grossa cucitura nel mezzo erano uguali a quelli delle altre. And this is really such a beautiful story about the sense of belonging, or the desire to belong, and the realization of not being able to fully belong.
Which year was it written?
This was written in the 70s, I think. Let me see. No, wrong. 48. No, sorry, this is Palazzeschi. What am I saying? Here we go. Yeah, 78. Okay, I'm not crazy. Yeah, published in 78. And then included in Silabario #2 in 1982. So
And you're going to read now in English, but not the translation of what you just read? Or
I can read the translation of that, or I can read the translation of another story, as you like.
Translation of
That.
Okay.
So let me go to Parisi.
The order of the short stories in Jhumpa's book is reversed alphabetical order. So she begins with Vittorini. Then you have Vergan back.
Melancholy. Every day that cool and distant summer, the children of the Bedin Alighieri colony, a camp for the poor managed by the equally poor sisters of St. Dorothy, were woken up bright and early and taken immediately on to the meadows or into the pine grove at the crest of the hill. 2 young nuns watched over them, dressed all in white for summer instead of the black habit and bonnet. They too were quite young and nearly as small as the children. They were boys and girls, and among the girls was a guest named Sylvia, referred to as a guest because she was the granddaughter of one of the founders, a socialist who was hardly poor. This is why Sylvia, unlike everyone else who wore the gray, collarless smock the camp required, made from cheap cotton, was able to choose from her little trunk her normal clothes every day. The shoes she always wore, and not the red rubber sandals that were part of the uniform, and even her own dolls and toys that she'd brought from home. She slept, however, in the dormitory with all the other girls, and so the rest of Sylvia's day was just like the others. The same breakfast, same lunch, same snack in the afternoon, same dinner. Even the white enameled bed and the coarse sheets with thick stitching down the middle were the same as everyone else's.
Thank you. I think now we can have a few questions from the audience. Thank you to whoever lent the Italian version.
I would like to start
Certo.
with the whistling microphone. Do you already have a sense of what the reception is in Italy of the book? Because it's not unheard of that Italians look very suspiciously when someone not Italian deals with Italian literature or culture.
Well, I was warned about that, and it's normal because the outside perspective is always threatening and regarded with some suspicion. Who are you to say? Who are you to know what we are or who we are? And especially, frankly, I haven't studied. I didn't get a PhD in Italian. I don't have that kind of long-term engagement to be able to say, okay, and now after devoting 35 years of my life to studying Italian literature, here is my, 40 authors for your consideration. It wasn't like that. That's not my reality. So I did. Even people like Domenico Starnone said, stai attenta, Jhumpa, because this is a risky thing you're doing. You're really, pushing our a certain limit here. But my editor at Wanda, Luigi Brioschi, who's very happy today because he publishes Peter Handke, who just won the Nobel Prize, one of them. Anyway, he was the one who said, when he knew that I was working on this project, he said, I think, facciamo in italiano. I think this is important. And he knew Vittorini, and he really admired Vittorini, and he is one of those authors who was really influenced by Americana. So when I would talk to him about my project, because, every now and then Luigi and I have lunch, and he asked me what I'm doing. So I said, for many of those lunches, I said, I'm still working on this anthology. So he was following it pretty carefully. And he said, I think we should make the book. We should make an Italian version of the book. And so we proceeded along those grounds, and I was happy to do that. I was excited to do that. And then there was a phase of comments about how, well, if we're going to make it into Italian, we have to adjust the curatela. We have to adjust your critical apparatus, because you don't need to tell us what certain things are, because maybe the non-Italian reader needs to know what Rai Tre is, or who is, what is this referring to when we talk about, certain things about Italian history or Italian culture, but we Italians don't need to know these things. And so they said, it's fine to propose the stories in Italian, but we really, your comments maybe have to really pull back, like things like, if I say Catania is a city in Sicily that is famous for, et cetera, volcanic explosion, these things people were saying to me, everybody knows that. We all Italians know these things. And at first I thought, okay, well, let me think about this. And then I thought, really, do they? Do all Italians know all of these things? Because I live in Rome and I go to the piazza every day and I see lots of Italians of all ages who are capable of reading. And I don't believe that all Italians know all these things. I just don't believe it. So I started to push back against this idea of modifying the book to conform to the knowledge base, as if there even is such a thing, of the Italian reader, which then seemed to grow into this sort of incredibly abstract, imposing encyclopedic genius who knew everything and needed no footnotes and no explanation about anything. And the more I thought about it, the more I really started to feel very strongly, because I had a sort of revelation, if you will, just as I was preparing the Italian version of the anthology, which is that the book exists in Italian not only for the reader in Italy who may have knowledge of Rai Tre and where is Catania and so on and so forth. It is for anybody who can read in Italian. That is why the book exists in Italian, okay? So when I think of those people, I think about my students at Princeton who are not Italian, like me, but read Italian. And maybe they don't know what Rai Tre is, and maybe they need a note. I think of people like Marina's daughter, Anna, who is Italian, but grows up on Park Avenue. And maybe she goes to Italy often enough, but maybe she doesn't know all of those references because she's growing up in another place. And then I think of all of the millions of Italians who are everywhere in the world, who have families, who have children, who have the language, who can read the language, who can appreciate the works in the original, but maybe don't have the cultural, first-hand context of certain things that are illuminating, right? And are helpful to know. And so that's why for the Italian version, I wrote an avvertenza. And I make the case that when we are talking about literature, we're not talking about these big, massive blocks of pre-assumed, predetermined knowledge. And what does that even mean? Does that mean we all went to Liceo Classico and those are the people that the book is for? Or does it mean, we just simply by living in Italy, that gives you the knowledge base? Or do you have to be a citizen of Italy? Or can it be for someone who's arriving to Italy tomorrow from who knows where and will make a home in Italy? Maybe the book is for that person, right? But my sense of the book in Italy is simply all you need to read the book in Italian is to know how to read in Italian. And you can be anybody. And that is my way of explaining that Italian is not a closed, small language that pertains just to the people who live on the Italian peninsula, because it's not. Because we could stop right now and start talking in Italian in New York, and there are, hundreds of people with whom we could have that conversation, and they're not necessarily even Italian by origin or descent or whatever, right? So this was very important to me, and I insisted on it. And that's why the Italian version is more or less a mirror image of the English version, because I believe that there are Italian readers in the world. I hope there will be Italian readers in the world who will appreciate some explanations, a few notes here and there. Maybe everybody doesn't know about Catania, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's one point I wanted to make. And then, but to answer the question of what was the reception, it was extraordinary. And the book was appreciated in Italy in a way that, I even was invited to give the book personally to the president of the Republic, to Mattarella. And that was really a sign of his openness and curiosity. And I sat for a moment in his beautiful office, and he said, "Tell me a little bit about what inspired you to do this project." And I thought, well, here is a great man, a great leader, making a great gesture, saying, this is an open culture and a curious culture and a curious and open government and attitude, and let me see what you from the outside, would like to share, and would like to how you would like to perhaps just readdress the conversation, right? Which is all this is. It's just another way of reconsidering a certain landscape. That's all it is. And so the reception was very positive. I went to so many places this spring to talk about the book. Michael and I did a lovely event in Rome. I went to the Scuola Normale. I went to Venice. I went to Milano. I went to the Casa Manzoni in Milano. I went to many places, and it was very respectfully and received with curiosity, with attention. There were reviews. It was, it was just it. Now I feel that it's now a part of, part of the current sort of way of thinking about the short story. So I'm really grateful for the reception.
Yes.
One question, thank you. With which writer did you struggle more at the beginning? And then you said, meno male, I included him or her in the anthology.
So by trouble, what do you mean? Gave. Oh, me? Yes. In terms of reading?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, they all appealed to me. They all drew me. They all spoke to me for whatever reason. I mean, I can say, one can say, okay, Landolfi or Gadda are their Italian is at a certain level of complexity that may be difficult for someone who's just learning the language. But by the time I was looking at the stories, I was able to really appreciate an author like Gadda or Landolfi. So it wasn't a struggle in the same sense. I mean, to be honest, the author I struggled with the most was Moravia 15 years ago when I first read Agostino in Italian, and it took me like a year or something, That was a struggle, but that was in a prior phase,
Hi. I'm really excited about reading your book because I've been reading Italian literature in English only since 2010, since the first time I went to Rome, and then I was picking books from Strand's 48-cent box, or sometimes the dollar box, or sometimes I would read, I would just do a search of a translator, what else have they translated, and then read what they've translated. But I had a friend, an Italian friend I was working with, who said, well, this is enough of this, you've got to read it in Italian. And I tried even with writers like Ginsberg, and I realized I'm not going to get it. I'm just not that good. But she keeps saying that, that it's, you have to do this. But anyway, but I had an experience with a friend in Italy who I told him I was reading Vitaliano Brancati, and he said, why would you want to read that? And then a few years later, he said, what have you read by Brancati? I've not read anything. And so I told him I'd read pretty much all not short stories, but I read all the novels. And one I couldn't recommend because I didn't think the translation was that good. That was my feeling. But I told him about the other ones and maybe which one to read first. And he said, wow, so I've had maybe a similar experience to you, but it's pretty much all I've been reading for 9 years now, almost 10. So what else do I need to say? Well, what do you think about reading only in English for people that aren't that good at languages?
Well, that's fine. I read so much literature in translation that I can't read in the original. We can only, unless we're geniuses who can read in 100 languages, I don't know. We're always going to be lacking some, we're always going to be lacking the greater part of the world's languages. So what we have linguistically is the tip of the iceberg of language. So maybe most people in this country just have one, maybe you have two, maybe you have 4 or 5. I don't know. I don't know who is the Guinness Book of World Record of who could read in the most languages, but who could really read in the most languages. I would guess it would be 10 languages, 12 maybe. But again, we're talking about the tip of the iceberg. So how do you really appreciate Japanese literature or Russian literature or whatever? There's so many languages in the world. There's so many great traditions. There's so many amazing bodies of literature and that is why translation is at the center of the conversation and at the center of this book and at the center of basically every conversation, because we are so grateful to it and dependent on it for good translators to have a proper literary conversation. I'm not able to read either of the 2 Nobel Prize winners in the original, and we all have so much time in the day, so that's when we trust the translator and appreciate the translator to allow us to experience that work and to connect to that work. And so much of the literature that changed my life when I was forming as a writer, and I feel that I'm always still forming as a writer, but the initial formation were, they were all in translation. I couldn't read Kafka. I couldn't read, Malraux. I don't know. I was just in a different place, and I could work my way through maybe Camus or somebody, but so many works of literature I just couldn't penetrate or grasp and appreciate in the original. So and people can say, oh, well, you won't really get it unless you read, and it's true. It's wonderful to be able to read Dante in the original. It's wonderful to be able to read any language in the original. There's no doubt about that, and that's what inspires people often to study a foreign language. I took Russian in college because I wanted to read Chekhov and Tolstoy. I lasted for a year and then I didn't go forward, but that was the intention. I still read Tolstoy and Chekhov, but I read them in translation. Sometimes it works out and you go the distance and you learn the language well enough to read in it, and that's great, but it's not a reasonable expectation to.
An immersion kind of, so she thought, well, why don't you just do that?
And I think you have a beautiful, your translation, your introduction also is an hymn to translation. You say, only works in translation can broaden the literary horizon, open doors, and break down the wall. I think it summarizes beautifully what is the function of translation. And of course, we encourage all of you to learn Italian, so that you can read Italian in the original, because the music and the harmony and everything that we can add. But translation is fundamental for us to understand the rest of the world through their great work. Yes?
I have the microphone over here.
I just wanted to ask, you've obviously made a huge commitment of time and energy into learning Italian and doing work in Italian. I'm just wondering what it is about Italian literature that draws you, that you want to, in a sense, share with those of us who don't know very much about it. And I don't mean that it's a beautiful language and it has a rich literature. I mean, is there something distinctive that really sort of grabbed you that made you embark on this journey?
I mean, I can just say in these stories, I was struck by just a lot of freedom in these stories, a kind of experimental attitude, if you will. I mean, but again, there's experimental writing in all languages. I mean, it's very hard to sort of make these broad sweeping statements about why. I think these stories, I think these authors are amazing authors who have opened up my mind and my sense of what literature can do and what a short story can do. And that's why they're in the book. So it's just looking at one slice, one language, one tradition. I think what makes many of these authors so interesting and so rich is their sort of hybrid identity, and the fact that so many of them were writer-translators, and the fact that many of them chose to actually, shift into other languages. So whether it's Alba de Céspedes, who ends up eventually writing in French, or Tabucchi, who devotes his life to the Portuguese language and to becoming a translator and teacher of Portuguese, and then writing a novel in Portuguese and becoming, sort of Pessoa's great translator and like importing Pessoa into Italy. Whether it's Vittorini or Pavese, writers who, translated so much of American literature and English literature, whether it's Anna Banti, I mean, whomever, like all of these authors were so interested in other languages. Cristina Campo, who translates Donne. And I just found that really so inspiring for me personally, and just just to think about like when this was normal as opposed to odd, and an unusual choice, and a choice that makes people sort of scratch their heads and say, why would you do that, or why would you want to, to do these things, and so that
historically Italian was a literary language. It was not a spoken language. So for like 600 years, basically, people who wrote in Italian at home were speaking something else. So for many of these authors, except for those who had the fortune of being born in Tuscany, Manzoni, definitely his first language was not Italian. He spoke Milanese dialect, and then the second language was French, and then Italian. So I think for somebody coming from the outside, feeling this proximity, you are also writing Svevo. Italian was not his first language.
Svevo. I mean, so many, that's the thing. They're almost all coming from the outside. That's the thing that's really, and that's why, me as your editor, clearly I have a stake in this game, because it is about saying, yes, we all come from the outside. There is no, let's just recognize this. So many of us are coming from the outside. And not only talking about, the existential position of the artist or the writer in terms vis-a-vis society or culture or whatever, which is, yes, true, and the artist must be on the outside or on the periphery, as Carlo Cassola says, but also literally on the outside, Svevo, on the outside. So many of these authors have that, have that point of view. Fabrizia Ramondino, raised in Spain, then goes to Germany. Pirandello, who writes his doctoral dissertation in German. Interesting choice. I mean, sometimes they're on the outside because of their circumstances, and sometimes they're on the outside because they choose to be on the outside, right? And I'm someone who's always lived on the outside, either because of my circumstances, and I had no choice in the matter, and now because I choose to be on the outside. So I've sort of experimented both ways of being on the outside. And I see so many examples in this book of that kind of positioning.
We have time for one more question, Direttore? Yeah, yes. Back there? Yes.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for your work. I'm wondering, because you began as a writer of fiction, and then you wrote a memoir, In Altre Parole, about your linguistic metamorphosis, and now you've established this identity as a translator. So I'm wondering what your future direction you think you're going to go in, and what influence the translation has had on that, becoming a translator, immersing yourself in that kind of.
Thanks for your question. Well, I mean, I think at this point, translation just forms a part of my project as a writer. And I, like so many of these writers, translation was just a part of, it's just something they did. And it's, I mean, and I tell my creative writing students at Princeton, you know, I mean, you can take a creative writing shop with me or with whomever, but if you really want to learn how to write, translate. That's how you really learn how to write, because it's only by reworking someone's really good sentences and wrestling with really, really sophisticated language that you can produce, I think, your own language. And it's sort of like, I think it's similar to, you know, when artists go into a museum and they do that kind of copying work. And I think translating can help. Translating, I don't mean to say translating is copying, because it's not. It's writing and it's inventing and it's finding solutions. But there's something similar in the sense of you're really absorbing, okay, what are the brush strokes? How does the artist work with color? What is the composition here? You really only learn that if you're looking at something so hard and trying to reproduce it in your own way. And that's, to me, a way of thinking about translation. Again, it's not a mere copy, right? Because even if, you know, I go to the museum and copy Picasso, it's not Picasso, and it's not, you know, it's like not anything. It's obviously my own interpretation, using what he's done, right? And trying to kind of echo that somehow. So I feel that translation now is just, I feel just fortunate because my work as a translator has clearly influenced every other writing, all the writing I do at this point. So that goes without saying, and I think there's so many examples of that in the book as well. You see the authors, you know, you see the echoes like Carlo Cassola, you see even his deep reading of a writer like Joyce. And then you see it in the story. You see the vestiges, you see the evidence, you see the echoes and the cadences and the ways of looking at things and describing things, which is really just so wonderful if you read, you know, just to sort of look at these layers and how writers are influenced by what they read and what they translate. And so yeah, so now I'm actually translating a book I wrote in Italian myself, and seeing.
You're translating your Italian novel into English, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm doing that, and I wrote.
How's that going?
It's going. It's weird. I mean, I talked about it this morning with a group of people. It's very disorienting. It's very frustrating because you're very aware. One is brutally aware of one's imperfections, and it's really like someone forcing you to look at yourself in the mirror for 12 hours, you know, and it's hard. It's really hard to face yourself with that intensity, but that's what it requires, or else it requires a kind of complete sort of, you know, using the first version as a way to then move into a second iteration, and to sort of do a take two. And I think Beckett was more in that vein of using his French to work out again in English some of these, you know, some of those great works. it's hard to be faithful to oneself for the obvious reasons. It's hard to sort of have that respectful relationship to oneself that I have towards Cassola or Parisi or Sarnone or whomever. So on the one hand, I do understand why Tabucchi did not translate himself back into Italian. I understand why Leonora Carrington, another one of these writers who moved out into different languages, didn't translate herself back into English. I understand the impulse because it's really hard to go back to a work you've already made and remake it. It's really hard, unless you're inspired to. And that's another interesting thing about this anthology, because there are a number of writers here who obsessively sort of reworked their own stories. Bilenchi, Delfini, these were authors who wrote sort of, just obsessively, version after version of the same story, which is what makes the publication history so complex. But there's sort of room for everything, I tried to put a little bit of everything into the anthology.
And the last question, observation, is that coming here on the subway with my friend Shua, we were saying that your introduction is probably one of the most political pieces that you have ever written. It's very explicit, and you go to the heart of the problems, both in Italy and in the US. And there is a reference that you make that while you were completing this work, it's the moment in which in Italy it seems that the slogan was "Prima gli Italiani," and this work helps us understand, or maybe put into question, who are these Italiani? What makes somebody Italian? And of course, literature has given throughout the centuries many answers to this question. There are never black and white. And I think that thanks to people like you, or thanks to people like Elena Janecek, the name doesn't sound very Italian. She won the Premio Strega 2 years ago. She was born in Munich from Jewish-Polish parents, Elena Janecek. And she won the Premio Strega with this beautiful book that takes place during, and she's going to be at the Institute, fantastic. Yeah. And this beautiful book that takes place during the Spanish Civil War. And it's thanks to people like you and her and many others that the Italian language is not going to be a fossil. You gave breath. I don't know whether you made the tower of Italian literature higher, but you definitely opened windows that were very needed. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Grazie.